The other big development we are tracking is in Cuba. It looks to have become a battleground once again for the U.S.-Russia rivalry. We told you what happened earlier this week, how a Russian nuclear submarine docked in Havana. Now the U.S. has sent its own sub to Cuba, a nuclear-powered fast attack submarine called the USS Helena. There have been a lot of American vessels called the Helena. The one currently in Cuba is the USS Helena SSN 725. It's a Los Angeles-class submarine and it's built to take down other subs. The vessel arrived in Cuba on Thursday, just a day after Russian warships docked in Havana. The American ship is not in the Cuban capital, though. It's in the U.S. naval base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. Many of you would have heard about Guantanamo Bay, or Gitmo as some like to call it. It's both a naval base and an infamous prison where the U.S. tortured people because torture is not permitted on American soil. So Guantanamo was their workaround, their offshore torture chamber. And now it is the site of a U.S.-Russia blinking contest. The Americans will deny this, of course. They say their submarine is making a routine stop, something they had planned weeks ago and informed the Cuban authorities about. This is probably true, but it doesn't change the optics. From the outside, it looks like the U.S. is challenging Russia, saying, whatever you can do, we can do it too. It's a strong statement. It keeps American pride intact, but it also puts the rest of the world in danger. Russia was clear when it sent its warships to Cuba.
As soon as it comes to military exercises, naval voyages, some kind of joint exchanges, delegations, or observations of various maneuvers, we immediately hear from the Western public questions and desires to clarify, what are these messages about? And when, speaking your language, we send messages through political diplomatic channels, when the president of the Russian Federation gives hours-long interviews, communicates with representatives of all countries, both friendly and unfriendly, answers questions from journalists, including from Western countries, somehow these messages, these statements, these hours-long detailed comments are not perceived as signals.
Moscow says it's the only way to get the West to listen. That without shows of strength, the West will not engage, and that logic is also problematic. It also brings the world closer to the edge, but does that excuse the American attempts at one-upmanship? The Russian vessels had already arrived in Cuba, so Washington knew that the region was a powder keg. Reports say that there were debates in the U.S. about going ahead with a submarine deployment, whether they should do it or not. There was a debate. In the end, it seems ego prevailed over common sense. The U.S. did not want to set a precedent. They did not want foreign movements to affect their routine deployments. So they went ahead and sent the USS Helena, ignoring the potential consequences of their actions. And it's not just Russia that's facing America's inconsiderate behavior. There's also another angle to this: Cuba's frustration. Cuba and the U.S. are not on friendly terms, but the U.S. has a base in the country. Ever wondered why? It's because the country signed the Guantanamo deal back in 1903. You heard that right, 1903, more than 120 years ago. The base was given to the U.S. in perpetuity for a few $1,000s a month. So Guantanamo is the oldest U.S. overseas base in the world. Havana says that Washington had strong-armed them into signing this deal. And they wanted to shut it down for decades. But the U.S. has refused to give it up. And Washington keeps antagonizing Havana with its activities at the base. Last year, the U.S. had sent another nuclear submarine to Guantanamo, despite Cuba's explicit protests. They did not want the submarine last year, and they did not want one this year either, and the U.S. knows this. They believe that Cuba approved the Russian submarine visit, hoping it would keep the Americans away. But the U.S., being the U.S., decided to do what it wanted anyway. Now, all of this is bad enough on its own. But yesterday, there was a further escalation, this time by an unlikely source: Canada. Canada decided to send a Navy patrol to Cuba, to the capital Havana, where the Russian warships docked on Wednesday. Canada is also saying that this is a routine visit, which has nothing to do with the Russian vessels being there. But all of this sounds too provocative to be routine. It's a sign that the world is approaching the brink. It seems as though we're already back in the Cold War era.